The hospital corridor echoed with expensive shoes and hushed business calls, until a child's scream shattered everything. "Please, someone help. They hurt my mommy, she's dying." 6-year-old Emma Chen stood in the sterile hallway, her pink dress torn, mascara-stained tears streaming down her face. Doctors walked past. Nurses glanced away. A security guard muttered into his radio, but didn't move. Then a man in a gray janitor's uniform dropped his mop. Marcus Reed hadn't run like that in 3 years, not since the accident that took his wife and destroyed his surgical career. But something in that little girl's voice pulled him back from the edge of the abyss he'd been living in. His hands, once steady enough to reconstruct shattered bones, now trembled as he followed Emma's frantic pointing toward the parking garage stairwell. What he found there would change everything. A woman lay crumpled at the bottom of the concrete stairs, blood pooling beneath her head. Designer suit torn. Briefcase contents scattered like broken dreams. Marcus's medical instincts roared back to life, drowning out 3 years of grief and whiskey-soaked nights trying to forget he'd once saved lives. "Emma, listen to me," he said, his voice suddenly calm with the authority he thought he'd lost forever. "Run back inside. Tell them a janitor needs a trauma kit and a gurney. Say cervical spine injury. Can you remember that?" The little girl nodded, terrified but trusting, and ran. Marcus knelt beside the unconscious woman, his fingers finding her pulse, weak, thready, barely there. The positioning of her body, the impact pattern, the defensive wounds on her hands. This wasn't an accident. Someone had beaten her before pushing her down these stairs. His hands hovered over her, and for the first time in 3 years, they weren't shaking. But what Marcus didn't know was that the unconscious woman was Grace Chun, CEO of Chun Medical Technologies, the very company that owned this hospital. And the men who'd attacked her were already watching from the shadows above, deciding whether to finish what they'd started. The parking garage camera had been conveniently disabled. The stairwell was deliberately chosen. And the hospital board members who'd ordered the hit were currently in a meeting 3 floors up, waiting for confirmation that their problem had been permanently solved. Marcus heard footsteps descending from above, slow, deliberate, not the rushing help he'd expected. Emma burst back through the door with 2 nurses and a trauma kit, but the footsteps above stopped. Waited. The nurses gasped when they recognized the injured woman, suddenly moving with urgent precision that hadn't been there moments before when it was just a janitor calling for help. "Dr. Morrison is in surgery," one nurse said frantically into her radio. "We need someone now." "I've got her," Marcus heard himself say. The nurses looked at him, at his janitor's uniform, his unshaven face, his hands already cutting away clothing to assess injuries with movements too practiced, too confident to be anything but professional. "You're not. I'm exactly what she needs right now. Her skull is fractured, she's bleeding internally, and if we wait for Morrison, she dies. Get me an oar." The authority in his voice, the precision of his assessment, the way his hands already had pressure on the bleed sites. Something made them listen. "Who are you?" the nurse whispered. Marcus looked up, his eyes hard with purpose he'd forgotten he possessed. 3 years ago, I was the best trauma surgeon on the East Coast. Today, I'm the only reason Grace Chin is still breathing. Emma grabbed his hand, her small fingers tight with desperate hope. "Please save my mommy." And in that moment, looking into those terrified child's eyes, Marcus Reed decided it was time to stop running from who he used to be. Even if it meant becoming a target himself. The emergency or wasn't ready. Grace Chen's pulse was dropping, and Marcus Reed had 60 seconds to make a choice that would either redeem him or destroy him completely. "She needs a cranial bleed evacuation now," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Prep her here. I don't care if it's unorthodox, moving her kills her." The nurses stared. A janitor didn't give orders in a hospital. But something in his eyes, the way he'd already established an airway and started manual compression on the internal bleeding site, made them move. "Sir, you can't just..." "My name is Dr. Marcus Reed. Check the registry from New York Presbyterian, 2019 to 2022. I've done this procedure 47 times. 47 people went home to their families because I didn't wait for protocol to catch up with reality." One nurse fumbled for her phone while the other, older and wiser, began prepping supplies. She'd seen enough death to recognize competence when it was fighting to save a life. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her small body shaking. Marcus caught her eye and softened just enough to be human again. "Your mom is strong, Emma. Really strong. And she's got the most important reason to fight right here. You." Now I need you to be brave like her, okay? The little girl nodded, tears still streaming, as a security guard finally arrived and tried to pull Marcus away from the patient. Step back from Mrs. Chin immediately. Touch me and she dies, Marcus said without looking up, his hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, so deep it survives even the darkest grief. Your choice. Follow orders from whoever sent you to make sure she didn't survive this, or let me do my job. The security guard froze. That single sentence had revealed too much. The fact that Marcus knew this was intentional, that there were forces in this building who wanted Grace Chin dead, that even now the conspiracy was unfolding around them. The older nurse's eyes widened with understanding. Tom, you need to leave. Now. But what nobody in that hallway realized was that Grace Chin had been investigating massive Medicare fraud within her own hospital network. Fraud orchestrated by 3 board members who'd already siphoned $40 million. They'd beaten her in the parking garage, stolen her evidence drive, and thrown her down those stairs. The last thing they expected was a janitor with the skills to save her life. Marcus's fingers worked with impossible gentleness, relieving the pressure building in Grace's skull through an emergency procedure that bought her the time she needed. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't by the book. But it was working. Pulse stabilizing, the older nurse whispered, while creeping into her voice. I've been doing this 30 years, and I've never seen. Where's Emma? Marcus asked suddenly, looking up. The doorway was empty. The little girl was gone. And so was the security guard. No, Marcus breathed, the terrible understanding hitting him. If they'd tried to kill the mother, they wouldn't leave a witness, especially not a 6-year-old witness who'd seen their faces. The older nurse saw his expression and immediately understood. Linda, stay with Mrs. Chin. Watch her vitals. Any drop, you page Dr. Morrison directly, not through normal channels. She looked at Marcus. I'll help you find the girl. You don't have to. My name is Patricia. I've worked in this hospital for 3 decades. I've watched it turn from a place that healed people into a business that feeds on them. If Grace Chin was investigating what I think she was investigating, then that little girl is in more danger than you know. They ran together through the corridors, Marcus still in his janitor's uniform, Patricia in her scrubs, both of them looking for a terrified child in a building suddenly transformed into a maze of threats. Marcus checked the parking garage first, the most obvious place to dispose of another accident. But Emma wasn't there. His mind raced through possibilities, then stopped on a memory. The way Emma had grabbed his hand earlier, the trust in her eyes, the way traumatized children often seek out the one person who'd shown them kindness. The janitorial closet, he said suddenly. 3rd floor, east wing. It's where I've been working. Emma saw me there this morning before this happened. I gave her a chocolate when she was waiting for her mom. They ran up the back stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Marcus's heart hammered not from exertion but from the terrible knowledge that he'd lost too much already in his life. His wife, his daughter, his career, his purpose. He couldn't lose this child too. Not when she'd been the one to remind him who he used to be. The janitorial closet door was ajar. Inside, barely visible behind a shelf of cleaning supplies, Emma huddled in a small ball, her hands pressed over her mouth to muffle her crying. Emma, sweetheart, it's okay now, Marcus said softly, crouching down to her level. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. The bad man said he was taking me to my mommy. But I heard him on his phone. He said he had to clean up loose ends. Marcus felt rage crystallize in his chest, cold, focused, protective. He'd failed to save his own family 3 years ago. He would not fail this one. Emma, your mom is stable. She's going to live. But I need you to tell me something very important. Do you know what she was working on? What she'd found out? The little girl reached into her torn dress pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. Mommy told me if anything happened to her, I should give this to someone I could trust. Someone brave. She pressed it into Marcus's palm. And at that moment, they heard heavy footsteps coming down the hallway, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Marcus had 30 seconds before those footsteps found them. 30 seconds to transform from a broken janitor into someone worthy of the trust a terrified child had placed in him. Patricia, take Emma through the service elevator to the basement. There's a tunnel system that connects to the neighboring medical building, old construction access. Exit on Riverside Avenue. He pressed the USB drive into her hand. Get this to the police. Real police, not hospital security. Ask for Detective Sarah Williams. She investigated my wife's accident 3 years ago. She's clean. What about you? Patricia asked, already pulling Emma close. I'm going to make sure you have time to run. Marcus stepped out of the closet just as three men in suits rounded the corner, too well dressed to be hospital security, moving with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this kind of work before. The one in front was the same guard from earlier, now showing his true face. "Dr. Reed," the lead man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Or should I say, Marcus the janitor? You've complicated a very simple situation." "Killing a woman and her child seems pretty complicated to me," Marcus replied, positioning himself to block the hallway. Behind him, he heard the quiet sound of Patricia and Emma slipping into the service elevator. Mrs. Chun had information that didn't belong to her. "We're simply protecting the hospital's interests." "The hospital's interests or your bank accounts?" The man's smile vanished. "You have no idea what you've stepped into. Grace Chun was going to destroy this institution over some accounting irregularities. $40 million that was creatively allocated to ensure this hospital could continue serving the community. She was going to tear it all down over principles. Principles like not stealing from Medicare patients, not marking up medications 300%, not falsifying insurance claims." Marcus took a step forward, his voice hardening. "I read the quarterly reports when I worked here. I know what you've been doing." What Marcus didn't say was that his own wife's death 3 years ago had been connected to this same fraud, denied coverage for an experimental treatment because the hospital board had already diverted the research funds. He'd been too broken by grief to investigate then. But now, holding that hallway, everything crystallized into perfect, furious clarity. "Last chance, doctor. Walk away. Go back to mopping floors and drinking away your memories. We'll even arrange a generous severance. I'm done walking away from fights that matter." The lead man sighed and nodded to his companions. They moved forward with the casual confidence of people who'd handled problems like this before. Marcus had been a trauma surgeon, not a fighter. But 3 years of grief, manual labor, and nightly runs where he tried to outpace his demons had left him harder than he'd been. When the first man grabbed for him, Marcus sidestepped and drove an elbow into his solar plexus with anatomical precision, exactly where the nerve cluster would drop him without permanent damage. The second came faster, smarter. Marcus took a hit to the jaw that sent stars exploding across his vision, but he'd been hit before. By life, by loss, by every morning he'd woken up wishing he hadn't. This was just pain. Pain he could use. He caught the man's arm, leveraged his weight, and sent him crashing into a medical cart. Supplies scattered. An alarm began to wail. The lead man pulled something from his jacket. Not a gun, but a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This would have been cleaner," he said, lunging forward. Marcus recognized the contents instantly. Potassium chloride, untraceable, would stop his heart in seconds. He twisted away, but the needle grazed his forearm, tearing fabric and skin. The burning spread fast, not enough to kill, but enough to weaken. "Security to 3rd floor east," someone called over the intercom. Real security this time, responding to the alarm. The lead man cursed, looked at his fallen companions, then back at Marcus, who was already feeling his left arm going numb. "You just signed that little girl's death warrant. We'll find her. We'll find anyone you care about. That's how this works." He ran, disappearing into the stairwell. Marcus slumped against the wall, fighting the drug spreading through his system. He had minutes, maybe less. The Real security arrived, found him there among the chaos, the fallen men, the evidence of a fight that would raise too many questions. "Sir, stay down, we've called medical." "Grace Chin," Marcus forced out through lips that were beginning to feel distant. "Trauma Bay protected, evidence." "Detective Williams." The world tilted sideways, then went dark. When Marcus opened his eyes again, he was in a hospital bed with IVs in both arms and a woman in a detective's badge standing beside him. Detective Sarah Williams looked older than he remembered, carrying 3 more years of cases and compromises and victims she couldn't save. "Marcus Reed," she said softly. "The man who lost everything and then found himself mopping floors in the same hospital that denied his wife's treatment. I wondered when you'd wake up enough to fight back." "Emma," he managed to rasp. "Safe. Patricia got her out, got the evidence to my partner. We've already arrested 2 board members. The 3rd is running, but he won't get far." She paused. "Grace Chin is awake. She's asking for you. Something about the janitor who saved her life being the same doctor she'd been trying to contact about her investigation." Marcus tried to sit up, failed. "I don't understand. Grace Chin spent 3 months investigating the fraud that killed your wife, Marcus. She found the paper trail, the denied claims, the falsified records. She was going to bring it all down. That's why they tried to kill her. Sarah leaned closer. She was looking for you specifically. Wanted your testimony. But you disappeared into a bottle and a janitor's uniform where nobody would look. The pieces fell together like a surgery he'd performed 1,000 times, each step leading inevitably to the next. His wife's death, his collapse, his anonymous exile, and Grace Chun, a CEO with principles, fighting the same enemy that had destroyed his life. Emma gave me something, he said. Told me her mother said to trust someone brave. That 6-year-old saved her mother's life twice. Once by finding you, and once by being smart enough to grab the backup drive Grace had hidden in her daughter's dress. Kids see things we miss. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling tears he'd been too numb to cry for 3 years finally breaking through. Can I see them? Mrs. Chun is down the hall. But Marcus, Sarah's voice went gentle. She's not just thanking you as a CEO. She's been where you are, lost someone to this same system, fought her way back by deciding to burn it all down if that's what it took to make it right. I think you two have more in common than you realize. Grace Chen's private room looked nothing like the sterile trauma bay where Marcus had fought to save her life. Evening light filtered through half-closed blinds, painting everything in shades of amber and hope. She sat propped against pillows, her head wrapped in bandages, her face bruised but her eyes sharp with the intelligence that had built a medical empire. Emma was curled beside her mother on the bed, finally asleep after the terror of the day, her small hand still clutching Grace's sleeve. The janitor who's really a doctor, Grace said softly, not wanting to wake her daughter. Or should I say Dr. Marcus Reed, the trauma surgeon who disappeared after his wife died from denied coverage for experimental treatment that my hospital's board had already stolen funding for. Marcus stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. Seeing them together, mother and daughter, alive because he'd remembered how to fight, felt like looking at a photograph of a life he'd lost. I didn't know you were looking for me. I've been looking for you for 6 months. Ever since I found the internal communications about your wife's case, the way the board overrode your attending physician's recommendations, how they marked the treatment as experimental when it had already been approved by the FDA, how they diverted the research funds to offshore accounts. Grace's voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of someone who understood loss. My husband died the same way. Different disease, same fraud. That's when I started digging. Marcus moved closer, his legs still weak from the drug they'd used on him. Your husband? Cancer. Treatable, if the hospital had actually ordered the medications they claimed to. Instead, they substituted cheaper alternatives and pocketed the difference. He died thinking his body had failed him. It took me 2 years to discover his body was fine. It was the system that was poisonous. She looked down at Emma, brushing hair from her daughter's face. I built this company thinking if I just worked hard enough, if I made enough money, I could protect everyone I loved. Turns out corruption doesn't care about your title. And that's when Marcus understood the real story. Grace Chen wasn't just a CEO investigating fraud. She was a widow weaponizing her grief into justice, just like he could have been if he hadn't drowned himself in alcohol and self-pity instead. She'd looked at the same darkness that swallowed him and decided to become the light instead. Why didn't you just go to the police 6 months ago? Marcus asked. Because I needed proof that would stick. The board members are protected by layers of corporate structure, shell companies, falsified records. I needed evidence, but I also needed witnesses, doctors who'd seen the pattern, who could testify to the systematic nature of the fraud. She met his eyes. I needed you, Marcus. The surgeon who'd lost everything, but still had enough integrity that he couldn't bring himself to work in a system he knew was broken. Even as a janitor, you kept your medical license active. Even in your darkest moments, you couldn't completely let go of who you were. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, the armor he'd built from whiskey and self-loathing, and the belief that he'd failed everyone who'd ever needed him. I watched them walk past Emma today. Doctors, nurses, security. They saw a child screaming for help, and they looked away. But I saw myself 3 years ago, helpless while bureaucracy and corruption killed someone I loved. I couldn't look away. Not again. You saved our lives, Grace said simply. Both of them. Emma tells me you promised her that her mom was strong, that she'd fight to come back because she had the most important reason right here. Do you remember saying that? Yes. My daughter has asked me 50 times since I woke up if the brave janitor is okay. She thinks you're a superhero. Grace's voice softened. She's not wrong. Emma stirred, opened her eyes, and saw Marcus standing there. Her face transformed with relief and joy that hit him harder than any drug. "You're okay. Mommy, he's okay." Marcus knelt beside the bed, so he was at Emma's level. "I'm okay because you were so brave, Emma. You ran for help. You kept your mother's secret safe. You trusted the right people. That's real courage." The little girl threw her arms around his neck, and Marcus felt something he thought had died with his own daughter. The fierce protective love that makes someone willing to fight impossible battles. He held her gently, this child who'd saved him by needing him to be someone worth saving. "Dr. Reed," Grace said, and there was something different in her voice now. Not just gratitude, but recognition. The way one soldier acknowledges another after they've survived the same war. "The police have arrested 2 board members. The third is running, but Detective Williams says it's only a matter of time. But the hospital itself is in chaos. The board has been dissolved, the fraud investigation will take months, and there are 63 doctors and 200 staff members who've been complicit either actively or by looking the way. You want me to testify? I want you to rebuild it." Grace shifted, wincing slightly, but her eyes were fire and purpose. "I want you to be the chief of surgery at a hospital that's going to be torn down and rebuilt into what it should have been all along. I want you to help me make sure what happened to your wife, to my husband, to countless others, never happens again." Marcus stared at her. "I've been a janitor for 3 years. I haven't held a scalpel in. You performed emergency cranial decompression in a hallway with a trauma kit and sheer determination. You saved my life using skills and instincts that grief couldn't kill. You're exactly what this hospital needs. Someone who understands what it's like to be failed by the system. Someone who'll fight for the patients instead of the profit margins." "I'm not that person anymore." "Yes, you are," Grace interrupted, her voice gentle but absolute. "You just forgot for a while. Emma reminded you. I'm just offering you the chance to remember permanently." Marcus looked at this woman, this CEO who'd nearly died for her principles, who'd turned her grief into a weapon against corruption, who was offering him not just redemption but purpose. He looked at Emma, who was watching him with complete trust, believing absolutely that he was one of the good guys. Maybe he thought, that's all redemption ever was, someone believing you were worth saving until you started believing it yourself. "If I do this," he said slowly, "I do it my way. No compromises with board members who want profit over patients. No looking away when something's wrong. No corporate bullshit," Grace finished, smiling despite her pain. "That's exactly why I want you." Emma tugged on his hand. "Does this mean you'll stay? That you'll keep helping people like you helped my mommy?" Marcus looked into those hopeful 6-year-old eyes and made a choice that felt like finally coming home after years of being lost. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'll stay." 3 months later, Marcus stood in his new office, not the janitor's closet, but a corner suite with windows overlooking the city where he'd once been someone who saved lives. The nameplate on his desk read Dr. Marcus Reed, Chief of Surgery, but what it really meant was second chances exist, even for the broken. The hospital had been transformed. Not the building itself, that took money and time, but the soul of the place. 23 doctors had been fired. 47 staff members had been retrained. The billing department had been completely rebuilt with transparent practices and external auditing. And every single patient who'd been defrauded was being contacted, apologized to, compensated. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough for the people like his wife who died before Grace Chin started her investigation. But it was something. It was a beginning. "Dr. Reed?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Patricia stood in the doorway, now head of nursing, wearing the authority she'd earned through 3 decades of caring, when caring wasn't profitable. "Your 3 o'clock is here." Grace Chin walked in, moving with a cane now but healing remarkably well. Behind her, Emma bounced with the irrepressible energy of children who've learned that even scary things can have happy endings. "Status report," Grace said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become not just his boss but his friend. They'd spent hundreds of hours together over the past 3 months, rebuilding a hospital, preparing testimony for trials, processing trauma in the way only people who've survived the same darkness can. "Surgical outcomes are up 40% since we implemented the new protocols. ER wait times have dropped. Patient satisfaction scores are—" Marcus paused, allowing himself a small smile, actually trending towards something resembling satisfaction. "And the staff? Adjusting. Some of them are thriving now that they don't have to choose between ethics and employment. Others are struggling with the idea that we actually mean it when we say patient care comes first." He looked at Emma, who was drawing a picture at his coffee table. But we're getting there. Emma held up her drawing. A stick figure in a janitor's uniform with a cape, holding the hand of a smaller stick figure. Above them, she'd written in careful letters, "My hero." Marcus felt his throat tighten. The drawing went on his wall beside his medical degree. Equal honor, equal importance. "The trial starts next week," Grace said quietly. "Are you ready? To testify about how systemic fraud killed my wife? To face the people who've hidden behind corporate structures and plausible deniability? To relive the worst moment of my life in front of cameras and lawyers and a jury?" Marcus met her eyes. "No, but I'll do it anyway. Because Emma's going to grow up in a world where her mother taught her that some things are worth fighting for, even when it's hard." What he didn't say was that testifying meant facing the real reason he'd become a janitor. Not just grief, but guilt. The guilt of not fighting hard enough, not questioning more aggressively, not burning down the system when he'd had the chance. He'd let his wife die quietly because he'd believed in the system. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Emma ran over and climbed into his lap with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd decided he was safe. "Are you coming to my birthday party on Saturday? Mommy says you're family now." Marcus looked at Grace, who was watching them with an expression he'd learned to recognize over their late-night planning sessions and shared grief, and slowly building something that might have been friendship, or might have been understanding, or might have been two people who'd lost everything deciding they could build something better together. "Am I invited?" he asked Grace, not Emma. "You saved our lives, rebuilt a hospital, and let my daughter draw on your office walls. You're not invited, you're required." She paused, then added softly, "Besides, you promised her you'd stay." 6-year-olds have long memories about that kind of thing. "So do adults," Marcus replied, thinking of his wife, of the promises he'd made to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, of the man he used to be before grief turned him into someone who hid from the world. Detective Williams appeared in the doorway, her badge catching the afternoon light. "Am I interrupting something?" "Just planning a 6-year-old's birthday party," Grace said. "You're invited too, by the way. Emma's requested that everyone who helped save her mommy has to be there. It's going to be the most awkwardly wholesome birthday party in history." Sarah laughed, then grew serious. "The third board member was arrested this morning in the Cayman Islands. He tried to access one of the offshore accounts and triggered the monitoring system. All 3 of them are in custody now. The trial is going to be massive: federal charges, state charges, civil suits from hundreds of victims." "Good," Marcus said simply. "There's something else." Sarah pulled out a folder. "We found more cases while investigating the fraud. Other patients who died or suffered because of denied treatments, falsified records, substituted medications. The pattern goes back 12 years. There are a lot of families who deserve to know what really happened to the people they loved." The weight of it settled over the room. 12 years of systematic theft disguised as healthcare, countless lives destroyed by people who valued profit over human beings. It was overwhelming. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of fight that Marcus had spent 3 years trying to forget how to fight. "We contact every single one," Grace said, her voice steady despite the magnitude. "We apologize. We compensate where we can. We make sure they know it wasn't their fault, wasn't their loved one's weakness, wasn't God's plan or bad luck or any of the lies we tell ourselves when the real answer is too ugly to face." "That's going to take years," Sarah warned. "Then it takes years," Marcus said. "We spend the rest of our lives making this right if that's what it takes. Because the alternative is becoming the people who look away, who choose convenience over justice, who let children scream for help while we pretend we don't hear them." Emma looked up at him, not understanding all the adult words but understanding the tone. The promise, the commitment, the choosing to be brave even when it's hard. "You're really a superhero," she said with absolute certainty. Marcus smiled, this broken man who'd been saved by a child's trust, who'd found purpose in a hospital hallway, who'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is decide to stop running from the person you used to be. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a janitor who remembered how to care. But your mom is the superhero. She's the one who looked at something wrong and decided to fight it, even when it was dangerous, even when people tried to kill her, even when it would have been easier to look away." Grace's eyes went bright with tears she wouldn't let fall in front of her daughter. "We're all just people trying to be brave enough to matter." Sarah nodded. "Speaking of which, I should go. Lots of evidence to organize, testimonies to prepare, justice to ensure actually happens for once." She paused at the door. For what it's worth, Marcus, your wife would be proud. The man she married is back. After she left, Marcus sat with Emma in his lap, Grace in the chair across from him, and the weight of impossible work ahead of them. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like purpose, like waking up finally meant something beyond just surviving another day. Saturday, 2 o'clock, my house, Grace said, standing slowly. Fair warning, Emma has requested a princess theme, superhero capes for everyone, and apparently a photo booth where we all have to pose like we're saving the day. Sounds terrible, Marcus said, grinning. I'll definitely be there. Emma hugged him one more time before taking her mother's hand. At the door, she turned back. Dr. Marcus? Thank you for not walking past when I needed help. For being someone brave. Thank you for reminding me I could be, he replied. They left, mother and daughter, survivors and fighters, leaving Marcus alone in his office with the view of a city full of people who needed hospitals to be places of healing instead of profit, doctors to be people who cared instead of looked away, and heroes to be anyone brave enough to stop running from who they were meant to be. He looked at Emma's drawing on his wall, the janitor with the cape, holding a child's hand, protecting the vulnerable, fighting the good fight. Sometimes, Marcus thought, heroes don't wear medals anymore. Sometimes they wear janitors' uniforms. Sometimes they're CEOs who risk everything for principles. Sometimes they're 6-year-olds who know that the scariest thing in the world is losing your mother, and the bravest thing is trusting a stranger to save her. And sometimes redemption isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering you were always worth saving. You just needed someone to believe it until you could believe it yourself. Marcus picked up his phone and called the surgical training coordinator. I want to start a program, free training for medical students who can't afford it otherwise. Fully funded, no strings attached, but with one requirement. Every student has to spend a month working in a non-medical capacity in the hospital first. Janitorial, kitchen, administration. I want them to see what this place looks like from the bottom before they start making decisions from the top. That's unconventional, the coordinator said carefully. So is a janitor saving a CEO's life and becoming chief of surgery. Let's make unconventional our specialty. He hung up, smiled at the city beyond his windows, and got back to work. Because every life saved, every system fixed, every person who learned to fight for what was right instead of what was easy. That was his wife's legacy. That was Grace's husband's memorial. That was Emma's future. And that was more than enough reason to be brave. Sometimes, heroes don't announce themselves with fanfare. They just show up when it matters, fight for people who can't fight for themselves, and remind us that being broken doesn't mean being finished. Sometimes, all it takes is a child's cry for help and the courage to remember who you used to be. And sometimes, that's how we learn what real strength looks like, not in never falling, but in getting back up when someone needs you to.